George Powell wasn't born in Banstead. He was born in Belmont. But his family had been local for a long time. His dad used to live down towards Reigate, and he worked at Powell's Asylum before he came north to Belmont to work at the asylum on Banstead Downs. There he married Lucy Letch in 1896, and they went on to have 7 children together. Now, George was one of the first of those children, George Robert Hillier Powell, born presumably at home, Ferndale, in King's Road in Belmont in September of 1898. He was baptised just down the road from the family home at Christ Church in Sutton. George's father, another George, moved to Banstead. They came to what was then called Laurel Cottages, which are now numbers 5 to 11 Shrubland Road, and they lived at number 11. Now, they were next door neighbours of the last man that we commemorated, or the man we commemorated at the beginning of May, Frank Wiscombe, who died on the 8th of May. He used to live at number 13, and they would have known each other well. They were neighbours for several years. George went to school, probably in the village, although we've lost our village school records, so we don't really know. What we do know, though, is that he kept rabbits, and his pet rabbits won 5th prize in the first Banstead and Burheath Fur and Feather Association pet show, which was held at the riding school at North Park, which is now where Burheath Asda is. He and his younger brother, Winston Baden Powell, that's one of my favourite names. He was born during the Boer War, so Baden Powell, obviously in honour of Robert Baden Powell, hero of one of the many sieges there, and presumably Winston for Winston Churchill, who was also a name that was in the news at the time. So the family grew up there in Shrubland Road. George was left school probably at the standard age of 13. He was too young to join up when the war broke out. He was only 15. He worked as a grocer's carman. So he was driving a horse-drawn cart, and the family used to have a picture of his cart many years ago, and fingers crossed that it turns up one of these days. Well, fantastic. And he might have been working for the grocer's pushmans, who were just down the road from them in Shrubland Road. He was conscripted when he turned 18, as many of our local men were, and so he joined up officially a few months after his 18th birthday. There was a delay in training these young men, so they would stay at home for a number of months before they were called up to begin their training. You couldn't serve overseas until you were 19, so they generally took them between the ages of 18 and 3 months and 18 and 6 months. And so that's what happened to George. He went down to Epsom, where he was attested. He joined a training reserve battalion, and he spent several months on the home front training. As he approached his 19th birthday, the time when he would be sent overseas, he was given 4 days pre-embarkation leave and would have returned to spend some of the summer, just a few brief days, with his family before he went overseas. When he turned 19, he was posted to the East Surrey Regiment, and he went overseas in October of 1917. Now, the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, we commemorated 13 or 14 local men who lost their lives in it. That was just coming to an end when he arrived. He was posted initially to the 12th Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, but he never went to join them. There were more pressing needs elsewhere, and instead he was transferred to the 1st Battalion, an old regular army battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, who had suffered some casualties in fighting just a couple of weeks previously during the Third Battle of Ypres. He was very fortunate. Although the fighting was going on, he didn't actually take part in any meaningful actions. The one action that his battalion did take part in, his company that he joined, number 3 company, didn't take much of an active part in that. They stayed in the safety of the shelter of their own trenches and threw smoke bombs to provide a smoke screen for the other men of his battalion that did take part in the fighting. It was a horrible place to be. There weren't really trenches to speak of. The rain and mud had seen to that. The trenches would just collapse, so there were lines of shell holes that were joined together with thin screens of wire in front of them. They were usually full of slimy water and were described rather euphemistically as unmentionable or indescribable things lurking beneath the surface of the water, and the men spent an awful lot of the time in the absolutely freezing cold and trying to avoid sliding down the slopes of them and into that horrible water at the bottom. They were not, fortunately for George, they were not there for very long. It was coming to the end of the battle, and they were withdrawn after the attack that I just mentioned. And they were taken, they went behind the lines to a place called Westoutre, a few miles away. And then they were withdrawn further into France to a small village called Auchy-les-Esdins, where they began a programme of training. So they built their own assault course and their own rifle range, and they were planning to spend a month there resting. While they were doing that, an emergency developed elsewhere in Italy. Now, the Italians had come into the war on our side in the spring of 1915. They'd seen an opportunity. They were aligned originally with Germany and Austro-Hungary, but they didn't come into the war on their side. They saw it as just a defensive alliance, and they didn't want any part of this offensive that was happening. And they saw an opportunity, while their erstwhile allies were busy, to steal some of their territory. And so they negotiated a secret deal with us, and we agreed that they could have some of Austro-Hungary's territory. And so they came into the war on our side. And just 2 months after they did that, they launched their first offensive. It was a disaster. In the northeastern corner of Italy, there's a river called the Isonzo, which is very near to the border of what's now Slovenia, and was then the edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They suffered heavy casualties in their attempt to cross that river, and they ended up entrenched in 3 years of bitter, very costly mountain fighting in that area. There were 12 battles of the Isonzo. They would happen pretty much regular as clockwork every 2 or 3 months, causing immense casualties. The Italians' morale became very, very low. Not only were they not winning, but they didn't like their own officers because they were much stricter disciplinarians than any of the other combatant armies that were taking part in the fighting. And so their nerves were shot. They'd had enough. And when the Germans sent troops to reinforce the Austro-Hungarians and launched a great big offensive in October-November of 1917, the Italian front collapsed and they fell back 50 miles. Reinforcements were urgently needed. We'd just completed the capture of the village of Passchendaele. Our own offensive had come to an end. And so 12 divisions of British and French troops were sent to reinforce the Italians in northeast Italy. And so George and the East Surreys and the whole of their division, 5th Division, started to leave for Italy. The first battalions of their division had just left in trains when the Germans launched a massive counterattack in France, at Cambrai, following our tank attack. And this caused yet another emergency that suddenly took precedence over Italy. And so the East Surreys and George were kept waiting in a field to see if they would be needed for several weeks. And while they were there in this holding position, George disobeyed an order, climbed into an orchard, presumably hoping to scrump some apples, was spotted by the appropriately named Company Sergeant Major Plum, who put him on a charge, and he ended up confined to barracks for 3 days. And it was a few days after he got out of his sentence that they were finally on their way to Italy. It was a journey that took 5 days. They'd scheduled halts every hour or so, or every few hours for the men to feed and water themselves, but it seems that nobody gave a copy of that schedule to their drivers, as the drivers would just stop whenever they felt like it. They would also start the trains whenever they felt like it, so no sooner had the men got off than the train would start moving, and they'd have to sprint to catch it up, and many of the men actually missed their trains and had to wait for the next one in order to get along. We forget, or we tend to focus on the horrors of war when we do this, and we forget that for many of these young village boys who'd never been further than the south coast, there were opportunities to see the sights. And we have people like George Turner writing about how strange the people in France are, how different they are. And we have Jack Baldwin's photos of him riding a camel near the pyramids as if he was on holiday. And this was almost like a holiday, an excursion for these men as they went to Italy. And they marvelled at the beautiful scenery. There was no sign of war around them. And this long, slow train ride gave them many opportunities to look out of the side of these horse carriages that they were, the horse wagons that were being carried in, and admire the scenery. Their band played on a flatbed truck that was pulled behind them, playing as they went. And they were received with adulation by people at every station that they stopped at. They were pressed with gifts of chocolates and flowers, and the locals particularly loved the band that played wherever they went. When they arrived in Italy, it was the band that won over the hearts of the suspicious Italian villagers. Their experience of troops had not been good. They thought that everything was going to be pilfered, and that they were really poor. They had very few food supplies of their own. They didn't speak the same language as these English strangers, and so it was the band that built the bridges between our East Surrey Regiment and the locals. And we soon were on a very good footing with them, and almost immediately the locals doubled the prices for all the food that they were charging. But our men could supplement their rations with polenta, spaghetti, and things like that, and also excellent red wine, Vino Rosso, much better and crucially much stronger than what they could have in France, and a lot cheaper. And so you can imagine the chaos that then ensued as the men, in the words of their commander, went a bit large after their time in the trenches for months. Things soon calmed down. They were waiting for a development on the Italian front. What was going to happen? Was the snow going to come in time to cancel any further offensives that the Germans had in mind, or were they going to be needed to be thrown into action? So that these British and French divisions were kept as a reserve, a last line of defence, and also as a counter-attacking force. And they spent weeks waiting in these small cramped fields full of vineyards, mulberry bushes and things like that, very unsuitable for training, so they couldn't do very much. And so there was probably quite a lot of relaxation going on. It was winter, so it wasn't that warm, but the sun was always shining, and it was a change from the rain, the non-stop rain of the Western Front at the time. They had a wonderful old-fashioned Christmas. They were given money to go and buy pigs, go and buy puddings. A supply of beer was laid on, and by all accounts, everyone had a lovely time. They were, of course, working at this time, and they were moving shells around and doing all kinds of menial tasks every soldier has to do when they're at least nominally at rest. But compared to the Western Front and the work they had to do, they were having a pretty fine time with it. In the end, they were sent, just after Christmas, they were sent into the lines to relieve the Italian troops on the River Piave. This was a flat bit of countryside. There was very few observation points. They were holding the embankment, near embankment on a river. So this tall, several feet high embankment gave them lots of shelter behind, so it's a perfectly safe place to be. The river was wide. The Germans were a long way away, so they didn't even bother shooting at each other, and people didn't have to even conceal themselves, and they would be very often seen in plain sight. So quite a cushy place to be at the time. There were lots of gravel islands in the stream. The streams, this river was just a network of streams, really. Lots of gravel islands. It wasn't too deep, so you could wade across it if you had to. And there were some ruined bridges there, which the Royal Engineers began to convert secretly into crossings that we could use, because we were going to launch an offensive, or rather the Italians were. They were going to be attacking from near Venice, and the East Surreys and their division were going to be providing a diversion. So lots of material, lots of shells and ammunition were all carried up to the front line, and these preparations were made on the bridges. And their division, 5th Division, were to cross this river, ferried in Venetian gondolas, no less, and spend 48 hours on the far bank and distract the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and then be withdrawn. Although that river was a network of streams, what happened in the spring, and they were starting to approach spring, was that the rain came and the river started to rise very rapidly, and it actually looked as if they'd even made it across, they'd never be able to make it back. And so that operation was cancelled. Just as it was cancelled, another emergency arose. Back on the Western Front in France, the Germans attacked on the 21st of March. They sent their best troops, they found the weak spots in the British line, and all of a sudden we found ourselves in this fighting retreat that went back miles and miles and miles over a period of a fortnight. The bad news almost immediately made its way to Italy, and the men spent several days in anticipation and eager to be back in the fight. Spent several days in anticipation they were going to be going back to France. And it didn't take long. It was just a few days later when they were eventually put back on a train, sent back to France. Now, I don't think George enjoyed the journey back very much, because as soon as he arrived back, he went into hospital. He was probably ill or had somehow managed to hurt himself. But he was in hospital for a short while and was then sent to a convalescent camp, which is called the Bullring, infamous, really, at Etaples. The men found it much more painful than being wounded in the first place very often. These awful bullying NCOs that were whipping these men back into shape. I've never heard a good word said about it yet. And he spent a few weeks there, 2 or 3 weeks there. While he was there, he missed an action that the East Surreys took part in. The Germans followed up their initial offensive with more offensive. One of their attacks broke through the Portuguese line. The East Surreys were rushed in to fill this gap. Luckily, the Germans, they'd had a bit of cabin fever after being in the trenches for some time, and they went wild, ransacking the cellars of this town that they'd captured, and basically got drunk for a day. And that gave us enough time to get our troops in place. And so when they did finally advance up to the line, we were ready and waiting for them. And it was in that situation that George found himself joining them sometime around early May, about the 8th of May. They were holding a line in front of the forest of Nieppe in northern France. It's near the La Bassée Canal, where so many of our men's stories take us. It's a very flat landscape. The whole area is crisscrossed with all these hedges that divide these fields, lots of irrigation ditches everywhere. So although it's flat, there's an awful lot of terrain, and you have to end up fighting effectively hedge to hedge there. Both armies had been on the move, so we didn't have these trenches, elaborate trenches they built up for 3 years. And so the German line was what described as being cubby holes, just these shallow foxholes really, and small sections of trench with a thin row of wire in front of them in places, and mostly based in ditches with these hedges in front of them. We weren't going to be launching a full-scale offensive for some time to come yet. We wouldn't do that until August. But what we could do, at least to frustrate the Germans and to keep them on their toes, was to raid them. And we launched several large-scale raids. And 100 years ago, yesterday, the East Surreys took part in one of those raids. They spent 2 days bombarding these hedgerows in advance. They sent out advance parties with billhooks, wire cutters to cut holes through these hedges. And so there were, at least in theory, ways through those hedges and into the German line when this raid took place. So in the evening, yesterday, 100 years ago, the company commanders gave the password Cheero, which meant they were ready to go. And about 4:30, they left their trenches and advanced across these fields. Their advance and the raid itself went remarkably well. George's company, number 3, were in the centre. Unusually, it always seems to be the problem with the battalions on the flanks, but the companies either side of them went extremely well. No one encountered any serious opposition. Number 3 company came up to this hedge that was in front of their objective and was struggling to find a way through it when one of the sergeants, Sergeant Taylor, noticed that on the other side of the hedge was a German machine gun team getting ready to go into action. Disaster was about to strike number 3 company. But he was a quick-thinking man, and he reached through the hedge, grabbed the end of the machine gun with both hands and pulled it through onto the British side, thus averting the danger. The East Surreys pushed their way through the hedge. The Germans had had enough. Most of them hightailed it, ran for their line in the distance, and the East Surreys shot them down as they ran. It was a similar story with the companies either side of them. They fought their way through these hedgerows, captured the houses that were the only real centres of resistance, and reached their objective line. And they began the work of consolidating, digging safe shelters for themselves, starting to erect wire to protect these positions. In the evening, the Germans started to bombard their trenches, and it reached a crescendo at about 3 a.m. 100 years ago today. The German troops were seen to be massing for a counter-attack, and as soon as they were spotted, these Surreys opened fire with every rifle, Lewis gun or machine gun that they had. And in most places, the Germans couldn't even get out of their trenches to launch this attack. On the left of number 3 company, the Germans, under cover of mist and smoke, managed to force their way into one of these trenches that the East Surrey held and began bombing their way down. But another party of East Surreys managed to get in behind them, and these Surreys sort of caught them in the middle of this trap and managed to drive them out and held on to their line. On the 20th and the 21st, casualties were, for this kind of operation, very low. 27 men killed. Unfortunately, George Powell, 19 years old, was one of those men. He was buried in Tannay British Cemetery in front of 100 of his comrades. He's still there today. His epitaph reads, "He died for his loved ones."
So, shall we have a prayer for remembrance? Almighty and eternal God, for whose life, whose love in Christ we cannot be parted, either by death or life, hear our prayers and thanksgiving for all whom we remember this day, especially for George Powell and for his family here today, and all those young men who gave their lives for us. Fulfill in them the purpose of your love and bring us all with them to your eternal joy. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And for reconciliation, as one family we reflect today on the horrors of the past that continue to haunt humanity and darken our world. Lord, where pain still overwhelms, bring healing. Where hearts are still breaking, bring comfort. Where peoples are still oppressed, bring liberation. And where communities are still victimised, bring justice. Where children are still brutalised, bring compassion. And where lives are still crushed, bring hope. Where evil is perpetrated, bring repentance. And where war still devastates, bring peace. But most of all, wherever a single voice cries out in the darkness, bring us to one another. In the name of the love you bear in your heart for all people, all nations, and all creation. Amen.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for there tomorrow we gave our today.
God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, and all the world, peace and concord. And may the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be among us and remain with us always. Amen.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.